he encounters an angry James Bulger, sticking a gun in his mouth, yelling at him, berating him. Some nerve giving your opinion about a property matter that affects his friend. Bulger, of course, didn't want to argue. He quickly agreed to the fine that Bulger imposed, that is, an extortion. He quickly agreed to pay $200,000 so he could get himself the heck out of there. And so he was lucky enough to escape the screenhouse. And he did leave, and you will hear how he then had to come up with $200,000. So he had to mortgage a property, and he wrote out a check for $200,000 to Stephen Flemmy, Bulger's sidekick. And then Flemmy cashed the check and split up the cash with Bulger, Flemmy, and Weeks. And we have a copy of the check. It's a lousy copy. It's a copy of a copy, but a copy nonetheless. Let me show you that. See, that's the check from Bulger to Flemmy for $200,000. And that's what Mr. Bulger used to get himself out of trouble with Bulger's gang. Now, Kevin Weeks, as you will hear, did more than just store guns and facilitate extortions for Bulger. He also helped launder money for Bulger, because criminals need a way to get their money into the banking system, and they often try to make it look like they have legitimate income and assets. And as I said earlier, when people conduct financial transactions with dirty money, money they earn through crime, that's a form of money laundering. And you hear about a business and a property. Piece of property in this case called the South Boston Liquor Mart, originally called Stipples after the original owner. And you hear about how Bulger obtained it with dirty money and with the help of a handgun. And you'll hear of subsequent real estate transactions that were conducted by Bulger and his gang, elaborate transactions designed to hide the people with true interests, all culminating in checks to Bulger years later, checks that are financial transactions that are a form of money laundering. Let me show you an example, if I could, of one of those many checks that you will see during the course of this trial. It was made out years after they acquired the property with dirty money and extortion from a thing called Shamrock Realty Trust. It's made payable to Bulger. These checks are considered financial transactions and are the basis of many of the money laundering charges in this case, which is basically taking money that comes from criminal activity and doing things that make it look like legitimate activity, like real estate transactions. You will hear that the delivery of cash can also be a form of money laundering, and you'll hear about that too, how Bulger authorized the delivery of cash to John Martorano at one point. Martorano was in jail in Plymouth. His family was in need of monies, so in order to maintain the peace in the enterprise, it was decided that he would get some of the money from this secret fund they called the X Fund they kept to pay off law enforcement or for emergencies. So Kevin Weeks arranged for a delivery of cash that ultimately went to Martorano's family. This is delivery of cash, which is another form of money laundering. You'll also hear in this case that Kevin Weeks helped coordinate activities with drug dealers, especially with a man named Joe Murray, the man Bucky Barrett had been quizzed about. Because ultimately, Murray became a source of cocaine for Bulger's organization. In fact, Murray, at one point, at Bulger's direction, provided over 50 pounds of cocaine directly to Kevin Weeks, and then again at Bulger's direction, Weeks parceled some of the cocaine out to the other drug dealers that were a part of Bulger's organization. Now Weeks, who as I said will testify, he did even more than drug dealing. He also helped bury bodies for Bulger. And while Weeks himself did not kill anyone, he was there several times when Bulger killed people. For instance, Weeks was the lookout when Brian Halloran and Michael Donahue got shot down on the South Boston waterfront. He was actually sitting there and was the lookout and was supposed to tell Bulger when Halloran came out of the restaurant. So he'll testify about that. And Weeks was there on three separate occasions when Bulger killed people at 799 East 3rd Street, a little house just down the street from the Bulger-Flemmy compound that I showed you earlier. And you hear about this house. It was owned by the brother of another gang member, and it was occasionally available for criminal use because that brother would go on trips to New Hampshire, and Bulger and his gang would occasionally use it. And the first murder that occurred there was the one I already told you about, the one of Bucky Barrett. But unfortunately, that's not the last murder which Bulger himself committed at that property. Because the next victim was John McIntyre. Because a year after Bulger killed Barrett, in the fall of 1984, a guy named John McIntyre was arrested for drunk driving. And he began talking. He began cooperating with several different agencies: the DEA, the Quincy Police, the FBI, and the U.S. Customs Agency. In fact, in this case, you'll hear directly from a former customs agent, a guy named John DeFago, who dealt directly with McIntyre. You'll hear that McIntyre was an experienced sailor. He fancied himself an IRA sympathizer, and he helped, at one point, bring a boatload of weapons, literally, a boatload of weapons on a ship called the Valhalla to the Irish coast. But the weapons never made it to Ireland because the ship itself was intercepted by the Irish authorities. So the boat, the Valhalla, and McIntyre came back to Boston. In fact, you'll hear some of the guns on that boat were from Bulger's gang. But anyway, McIntyre gets back to Boston, goes out, gets himself drunk, starts talking to the cops. And he was, for a while, a productive cooperating witness. In fact, you'll hear from Don DeFago that McIntyre gave some of the information that led to the seizure of 36 tons of marijuana on a boat called the Ramsland. Now, McIntyre didn't have a very long career as an informant because he soon disappeared. And he disappeared because Bulger suspected that he was, in fact, an informant. And in order to determine whether, in fact, McIntyre was an informant, Bulger had McIntyre invited back to that house at 799 East 3rd Street. Told him it was a gang member told him there was going to be a party there. So you'll hear testimony that McIntyre arrives with a case of beer. But there's no party. What there is James Bulger, this man over here behind me, the defendant, once again, like with Barrett, pointing a gun at the man who comes in the door, this time, John McIntyre. Now, like Barrett, McIntyre was led to a chair and chained to the chair. And like Barrett, he was questioned repeatedly by Bulger and Flemmy. And McIntyre soon admitted that he had been cooperating. And that was like sealing his own death sentence, because after he admitted that, the questioning continued for a while. And then McIntyre was led downstairs to that basement at gunpoint, and McIntyre was placed on a chair, and then this man over here, the defendant, James Bulger, tried to choke him to death with a rope. But the rope was too thick. Couldn't kill him. All it did was make him gag. So as he was gagging, Bulger asks him, "You want one in the head?" And McIntyre says, "Yes, please." And at that point, Bulger shoots him in the head. And then, like Barrett, McIntyre is buried in the dirt floor. Now, several months later after this murder of McIntyre, Kevin Weeks was told by Bulger to go back to the house. They were going to meet Stephen Flemmy, Bulger's longtime criminal partner in crime, and partner in the informant business. And Weeks was told Flemmy was coming by with his stepdaughter, Deborah Hussey. But Weeks was relieved when he heard that Flemmy was coming by with his stepdaughter. He thought with her around, nothing bad would happen. But Weeks was wrong. Because years earlier, Hussey had been molested by Flemmy, and she had a tough life. And as you will hear in this case, a much tougher death. A death at the hands, literally, at the hands of Bulger. Because Hussey was getting in trouble with the police, and she was seen as a threat to Flemmy, might be able to get Flemmy arrested. So Weeks was upstairs using the bathroom when he heard Flemmy and Deborah Hussey arrive. What does he hear next? He hears a big thud, like someone falling to the floor. Because in fact, that's what was happening. Deborah Hussey was falling to the floor as James Bulger strangled her, strangled this young woman to death. And then she too, like Bucky Barrett and McIntyre, was buried in a dirt grave in the basement. So that's what we're dealing with here in this case, a hands-on killer who is the leader of an extensive criminal enterprise. Now this enterprise, or group of criminals, in the early days was known as the Winter Hill Gang, or the Hill. Sometime later it was called Southie, because that's where Bulger was from. But in the early days, it was known as the Winter Hill Gang, or the Hill, and that's after a section up in Somerville. And the leadership of this group changed over time. Originally, Bulger and Flemmy were one of several leaders of this group, but eventually, Bulger and Flemmy seized control. And let me show you a picture in 75. The main guys in this criminal enterprise were Bulger, Flemmy, Martirano, Howie Winter, Joe McDonald, and Jimmy Sims. Now, the fact that Winter's last name was Winter, that has nothing to do with the fact that it's called the Winter Hill Gang. It's just a coincidence that the group was from the Winter Hill section of Somerville. Now, in the 80s, Bulger and Flemmy seized control because 3 of these guys became fugitives. That is, they ran away from Boston from federal charges. Martirano ran away, McDonald ran away, Sims ran away, and Howie Winter went off to jail, leaving Bulger and Flemmy, who were soon joined by a younger criminal named Kevin Weeks, who I've mentioned. And it's during the 1980s. That's when Bulger and his crew made a ton of money selling drugs, especially cocaine. And there were lots of people involved in this drug side of their business. It was a business. Even though it was illegal, its purpose was to make money. Let me put up one last chart and go through some of the names of the people you will hear about in this case. Now, as I indicated earlier, some of the drug dealers were simply extortion victims, had to pay rent or were levied a fine. Guys like Frank LaPerry, you'll hear about, giant marijuana dealer back in the 80s. He had to pay all the time when he bought a load of marijuana into the Boston area. Another two guys, Anthony Attardo, David Lindholm, they were simply extorted. Not simply, but they were extorted on one occasion, and you'll hear from them as well. There were other dope dealers who were part of this network who were both extorted and supplied drugs to Bulger's operation. For instance, that man I mentioned before, Joe Murray, who Bucky Barrett was questioned about, he began supplying cocaine to Bulger's organization. And as you will hear at the end, when he no longer wanted to be part of this, he was forced to make a severance payment, a big extortionate severance package of $500,000 in cash that he had to pay to Bulger over by the Boston Aquarium. But you will hear directly from some of these drug dealers, including William Shea, Billy Shea in the middle. He eventually became the main guy for the cocaine dealing in Southie under Bulger's control. And he would come before you and testify, and he'll tell you how Bulger used to come over his house all the time. Kevin Weeks would generally drive him over there, and they would discuss lots of things, including the drug business. And you will hear from Shea that he had a variety of sources for the drugs, but at one point when he was getting cocaine from a couple of Colombians, the supply wasn't there. So Bulger himself set up a new source of cocaine for Shea in the organization. Bulger himself, told Shea, "Let's go meet with a guy from Charleston." It turned out to be Murray. Bulger himself arranged to meet with Murray, and Bulger himself brought the money to the deal, as did Shea, and there was the beginning of a relationship with Murray when Murray supplied the cocaine. In fact, shortly after this original meeting, set up by Bulger with Shea, with this other drug dealer, Kevin Weeks was instructed by Bulger, "Go meet with Murray and pick up some coke." And Weeks picked up 2 large toolboxes containing over 50 pounds of coke. And then subsequently, at Bulger's direction, he parceled some of it out, some to Shea, some to a couple of other individuals, and then actually returned a lot of it to Murray because it was needed in Charleston rather than Southie. Now, Weeks is also going to testify in this case. He received a reduced sentence from a federal judge based on his cooperation. As he will tell you, he testified at several trials. And he also took investigators directly to the bodies of Bucky Barrett, John McIntyre, and Deborah Hussey. But he didn't take them to the basement of 799 East 3rd Street. He took them to a little field across from Florian Hall in Dorchester, because the bodies were actually dug up and moved on Halloween in 1985. And Weeks will tell you about that gruesome process. He'll tell you how Bulger and Flemmy decided that the bodies had to be moved because the house was going to be sold, and they didn't want the bodies being discovered. And Weeks, as I said, he'll tell you about this gruesome task. But the bodies were eventually discovered, because on a freezing cold night in January of 2000, the state police and the DEA went to a little field in Dorchester, across from Florian Hall, and there Kevin Weeks pointed to a spot where he said there would be 3 bodies. And in fact, that's where the law enforcement began digging, and eventually they pulled 3 skeletons from the earth, 3 skeletons of John McIntyre, Deborah Hussey, and Bucky Barrett. Now this case will have a lot of witnesses, a lot of pieces of evidence, and like I said earlier, it's like putting a puzzle together. And you will hear that a lot of the witnesses originally refused to testify when they were called before a grand jury, either because they didn't want to admit their own crimes, or it's because they were afraid of Bulger and his gang. And when that happens, when a person goes to a grand jury that's investigating something, they have a Fifth Amendment right to refuse to answer questions. But a court order can be issued, sometimes called a compulsion order or an immunity order, an order that means the person can talk without fear of getting prosecuted for what they say. So the compulsion order or the immunity order supplements that person's Fifth Amendment right. Now you will hear that in this case, sometimes the witness even refused to testify, despite the issuance of the court order. And when that happens, as you will hear from these witnesses, the witnesses are held in contempt and sent off to jail until they agree to testify. For example, remember that bookie, the bookmaker, Dick O'Brien we talked about at the beginning of this? Well, he was called to grand jury, and he refused to testify. He was immunized. That is, a court order was issued compelling him to testify. Despite that, he refused to testify. And he will tell you, he didn't want. He was more afraid of Bulger and his gang than that court order. So he went off to jail. And government bureaucracy, being what it is, they sent him to jail and put him next to Flemmy and Maturano. And they suggested to him, a suggestion he took, was that he could go back to grand jury and simply lie. Blame it on a sick and dying co-conspirator named George Kaufman. So that's what he did. Went back and told them some story about George Kaufman being responsible for everything. And he was released. What you will hear, that, years later, when John Martorano agreed to cooperate, O'Brien was no longer afraid. O'Brien came back to the grand jury and told the rest of the story. Now eventually, Bulger was indicted or charged with his many crimes. Unfortunately, one of Bulger's corrupt law enforcement contacts, John Connolly, was able to tip him off about the impending charges. So what does Bulger do? He runs away and hides. He hides for almost 16 years in California. But as you will hear, his luck eventually runs out, because in the summer of 2011, honest FBI agents who were tracking him did in fact track him and arrest him. When those honest FBI agents arrested him, they found guns, they found fake IDs, and they found cash, over $800,000 in cash. At that point, Bulger was brought back to Boston, and now here we are with an indictment of containing, as I said, 32 counts, the 23 money laundering charges that I went through, a couple of racketeering charges, 5 gun counts, mostly machine guns, and 2 extortion counts. Now the racketeering charges, consist of a lot of racketeering acts, including 19 murders, and I've been able to touch upon a few of them, but you will hear evidence in this case that the defendant, James Bulger, and his gang were responsible for over 19 murders, 19 different people, over almost 30 years of crime. You will hear about Michael Milano, Al Plummer, William O'Brien, James O'Toole, Al Notarangelli, James Salsa, Paul McGonigal, Edward Connors, Thomas King, Buddy Leonard, Richard Castucci, Roger Wheeler, Deborah Davis, Brian Halloran, Michael Donahue, John Callahan, Bucky Barrett, John McIntyre, and Deborah Hussey. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what this case is about. A defendant, James Bulger, who was part of a criminal gang which extorted people, paid off cops, earned a fortune dealing drugs, laundered money, possessed all sorts of guns, and murdered people. 19 people. And so at the end of this case, one of my colleagues will stand up before you and ask you to return the only verdict that this evidence in this case supports, and that would be a verdict of guilty as charged. Thank you for your attention.